Welcome to This Matters. I'm Sabai Tazaz. Today, I'm joined by Amira Elghawaby, who's Canada's Special Representative on Combating Islamophobia. Earlier this month, her office released a new guide on understanding and addressing Islamophobia. With hate rising and communities increasingly divided, Amira's work has never been more critical than now. Today, we talk about the challenges she faces, the launch of her new guide, and what the future holds in this current political climate that we find ourselves in. Hi, Amira. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much, Sabah, for having me on your program.
Well, first of all, I know we're more than halfway through, but I do want to wish you a happy Ramadan.
Thank you, and to you as well.
Thank you. So, Amira, you took on this role basically knowing the scale of the challenge. Islamophobia is not just an abstract issue to a lot of us, it has real consequences to people's safety, to their dignity, to their rights. And you're almost halfway through now. And I wonder what you've taken from it all. Do you feel like we're any closer to meaningful change, or do you feel like what's been happening in the last 2 years and the sort of consistent backlash, does it make you feel like it's sort of a constant fight to just hold the line?
hmm Well, I mean, that's a very deep question, Sabah, and I think on any given day, you might get a different response, right? Because the reality is when it comes to any form of hate, including Islamophobia, there are really tough days, and then there are days that you've got some hope on the horizon. And so I think that would be a really good way of describing what the last 2 years in this role has been like. There have been some very difficult, dark days in which we commemorate, for instance, very painful commemorations like the tragic, deliberate killing of the Afzal family in London, Ontario, which happened in 2021, or the Quebec City Mosque massacre, which happened in 2017. And so, those are moments where we are reminded of what's at stake if we don't address the dangerous phenomenon that is Islamophobia. But beyond that, we also know the day to day experiences that people can face that don't get to that level, thank goodness, but still have really deep impacts on people's safety and well being. So, for instance, the Senate report that looked at Islamophobia and was released just over a year ago found that many members of our communities are experiencing, whether it's microaggressions, whether it's discrimination at work, whether it's a lack of accommodation. And so those are also challenges. But the reason there is hope is because more and more Canadians have indicated they want to have these conversations. So, for instance, there was a poll put out by Leger that found nearly half of Canadians want to be allies and they want resources on how to be allies. So those sorts of numbers, the types of folks that I meet just in my work who really do care a lot about what it means to be Canadian, what it means to hold on to the diverse backgrounds and experiences that people bring forward, really gives me the energy to continue to do this work. And I think really should give us both that hope and inspiration that what we are trying to do does have an impact.
And you've just released this unique guide on understanding and tackling Islamophobia. It's like you said, the poll says there are a lot of people wanting to know how to be able to be good allies, but it's also a politically sensitive and polarized environment at the moment. What do you hope that this guide will achieve, and why now?
hmm Well, I think that, as I mentioned, many Canadians really do care about inclusive communities, that we have these shared values of mutual respect, effort to understand one another, pluralism, living in a country that is still coping with reconciliation and still addressing, what it meant to be a settler colony and how that's impacting Indigenous communities and all that we have to do to pursue social justice. So we are fortunate to live in a country like Canada where we can have this learning together. And as I mentioned, many Canadians have said they just need resources. They want to learn more. And so one of the most important ways that we can support those efforts is by providing resources. And so the guide on understanding and combating Islamophobia for a more inclusive Canada is a resource now that is quite comprehensive. It provides such a wide overview of first of all, looking at the diversity of Canadian Muslims and that we've been here even before Confederation, that we have deep links to Canada and deep efforts to contribute in so many different ways.
Mhm.
We look at the diversity of our communities themselves, where people come from, looking at the age demographics, and then beyond getting into who we are and what we stand for and what our values are, what are those myths that sadly continue to perpetuate around our communities, all of that misinformation, disinformation, and hate that has become monetized, weaponized online spaces. Saba, I don't have to tell you, for instance, and many of your audience will know how Islamophobia is used against many of us to even try to limit our ability to speak, to participate in social life, in public life. And so we unpack those myths and sort of provide reality checks on them in the guide. As well, we talk about intersectional identities, the way that people can experience Islamophobia, but compounded with other forms of oppression. And
Mhm.
then we talk about some of the types of efforts that individuals and organizations can undertake to start to be more and more part of the solution to restoring those efforts to create inclusive society, inclusive communities, workplaces, schools, etc. So it's really quite comprehensive, but I'm sure once your listeners have a chance to read it, they will see that it's actually a quick read, and it brings forward so many pieces of information that would otherwise take you a really long time to get through, but
Right.
we've put it for you in this easy to use guide that we really hope people will benefit from.
We'll definitely attach a link in our show notes to that as well so people can have a look. Amira, the section on anti Palestinian racism in the guide was an important one and a controversial addition. There have been observations that for many Palestinians in Canada, their experiences of discrimination might go beyond just Islamophobia into a kind of broader systemic sort of erasure. Why was it important to include this section?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do have a full section on intersectional identities, and it's not exhaustive because certainly just, our communities are very diverse as any other subset of a community is. And so we try to explore different intersectional identities, including, of course, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Canadians who identify as Muslim. That group has certainly been experiencing really, really heightened levels of both Islamophobia and anti Palestinian racism over not just over the past year and a half or so, but this has been a constant, like, lived experience for many, many Canadian Palestinians. And so, of course, it was absolutely very important for us in the guide to outline what that looks like, how it manifests, because there have been a lot of questions swirling around what it actually means. When I had met with the previous prime minister in the fall, there was a commitment he made that Canada and the government should acknowledge and identify anti-Palestinian racism. So my work really is in keeping with that. And certainly, in speaking with members of Canada's, very diverse Muslim communities, including Palestinian communities, hearing from them that not only does anti-Palestinian racism impact Palestinian communities, but it can have even wider impact. So being able to start having those conversations, and many of these conversations are already being had at school boards and workplaces, etc., it was certainly important to ensure that we address this form of racism.
Has there been backlash?
Well, I don't pay attention to backlash because there were always going to be in any type of democracy you're going to have different points of view. So I don't really spend too much time thinking about that. All I am committed to doing is providing a solid product, a solid resource for Canadians to be able to do. And we had wide consultations, including with Jewish communities as well,
Mhm.
on this guide. So we've done a lot of work to ensure that it reflected the concerns and the ideas and the thoughts and reflections of diverse groups of scholars and community organizations, as well as different communities to get their read on it, because we do want it to be a resource that anyone can pick up, use, utilize, and empower themselves.
And there's another part of the guide that I really do want to talk about. It makes it clear in your guide that criticizing Muslim majority countries is not Islamophobia. And I think it's a distinction that's particularly relevant in the current climate where conversations about global conflicts and actions of governments and states can often be seen to be weaponized. So, why was it important to address this directly?
The reason it was really important to include in the guide a section that talks about what Islamophobia is not is because whenever there have been efforts to have conversations about Islamophobia in Canada or anywhere else, there's often this sort of red herring pulled out. Oh, Islamophobia is just an effort to silence criticism of Islam. No, we're not going to have this conversation. And so many of your listeners may remember when, past political candidates in different parties would even, have images of, a woman with something, stuck across her face, masking tape. And this was in relation to Motion 103, which was a parliamentary motion a few years ago to talk about Islamophobia and address it as a systemic form of discrimination. And the connotation is that this is to silence speech. And so absolutely not. Islamophobia is about specifically the racism, the discrimination, viewing our communities as greater security threats than other communities. That's what this is about. And so you can criticize Islam all you want. You can criticize a Muslim majority country all you want, as any other faith, ideology, country. But what we are talking about is specific targeting and direct racism and harm that is brought to members of Muslim communities. So it wasn't really important to make that distinction of what we are talking about.
So, Amira, what many people have been observing has been that there's been a growing battle over language itself. Terms are being maybe weaponized or conflated and used to discredit or silence entire communities. And we're seeing a dangerous conflation of terminology where people experiencing it say that legitimate criticism is mislabeled as hate and that misrepresentation is having real consequences for communities on the ground. Do you think this war over language is making it harder to combat hate? How do we even begin to untangle these conversations in that kind of environment? And how do you see this, all of this playing out a role in how Islamophobia, anti Semitism, and anti Palestinian racism is being talked about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is we begin with first principles. Of course, all of us should be standing united against any form of hatred, any form of racism, discrimination. Just as I stand against Islamophobia, I would stand against anti Palestinian racism. I would stand against anti Arab hate. I would stand against anti Semitism. We're all clear on that. The issue, though, for our communities, for Canadian Muslim communities, is that since October 7th, we have seen a real tension and, in fact, threat against the civil liberties of many within our communities and beyond our communities who have wanted to exercise their freedom of speech to speak out for Palestinian human rights. And I've certainly been very clear in my statements that I have issued, as well as what I have been saying publicly, that our communities are not going to go back to where we were post 9/11, where we were constantly being expected to apologize for actions that had nothing to do with us, for expecting to answer for any type of terrorist act. We're not going to go back to that place. We are Canadians. We have the same rights and freedoms as anyone else. We have the right to peacefully protest. If we choose to, we have the right to speak out against any type of injustice or any issue. These are fundamental human rights that we must preserve. So the effort that has been underway from certain quarters to smear entire peaceful protests as hateful, for instance, or completely undermining the overwhelming peaceful nature. And I've spoken to law enforcement. I've spoken to police chiefs across the country who have assured me and told me that the vast majority of protests that have been held in this country have been very peaceful. If anyone has broken the law, if anyone has engaged in hate speech or incitement, they should be held accountable to the full extent of the law. No one is saying otherwise. But there has been this real deliberate concern that many have had around the ways in which civil liberties are being threatened in our country. And this is something that we see happening with Islamophobic types of tropes being used against our communities, that we don't belong, that we don't have the right to be speaking up for issues that we care about, that we are disruptive to the social order. These are all the types of myths that I unpack in the guide.
Right. And like you're speaking to, Amira, we are living in an exceptionally painful time. Since October 7th, there's been reports of disturbing rise in Islamophobic attacks and anti Palestinian racism and anti Semitism. But you've been having these conversations, like you said, with law enforcement and other stakeholders. But many would say that there's also been a sort of institutional reluctance to acknowledge what's really going on. What do you think? Do you feel that Canada's leadership truly understands the urgency of this moment and what we're seeing happening right now?
Well, my role is to provide advice to the federal government, to federal ministers, about the way that policies are impacting on Canadian Muslim communities. That's my role. And that's what I've been doing for the past 2 years. So, listening to what communities are experiencing, bringing that to the forefront, ensuring that their concerns are really explained, and we look for solutions together. And so, from my perspective, that is my mandate. It is to ensure that institutional leaders within the federal government are aware of concerns, and looking for ways to fix wherever there might be an issue. So, from my perspective, the very reality that my office exists speaks to a commitment by the federal government to address many of the concerns that we've been talking about. But it's really important for your listeners to know the reason my office exists is because people were killed in this country. 11 Canadians were killed in Canada between 5 year span. That's the highest number of any other G7 country. This deadly Islamophobic violence led our communities to call on the federal government to take action. And again, one of those actions was the creation of this office. So I invite people to actually go to the website to see the statements we've put out, to see the guide, to see our annual report about the activities that we've been undertaking. And that's sort of my commitment, is that I continue to bring these issues to the fore. And we continue to look for those who are ready to get to work on ensuring that everyone in Canada has the right to feel welcome, to feel that they belong, to ensure that their rights and freedoms are respected, to have the accommodations that they require in their workplaces, in their schools, and to really work for that cohesive country that we all deserve.
You've addressed this in the guide, Amira. There's the accusation that fighting Islamophobia somehow undermines free speech. In is one that we hear over and over from certain groups. We hear it sometimes from some political leaders. And it often is a claim that doesn't address the reality of whose voices are actually being suppressed here. How do you respond to that kind of framing when someone talks about tackling Islamophobia as somehow undermining free speech?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good point you raise, and it's something that has been brought up by various racialized communities in Canada, where we have seen a rise in racist or even sexist types of narratives online, homophobic narratives online, that are actually driving people off of social media altogether. So the idea that talking about Islamophobia is limiting anyone's free speech really obscures the reality, is that the rise in hateful speech online against so many different communities
Mhm.
is actually driving so many people off of these platforms. And that is limiting their ability to freely practice their speech and their ability to engage on issues of our time. And so we have to remember that freedom of speech is not an absolute right. There are limits. And it's very important that we understand that people have the right to speak about what they want, for sure. And we're not trying to limit people's ability to say, criticize anything. But at the same time, you can't just say whatever you want and hurt people and harm people. After the massacre in Quebec City, where 6 worshippers were killed by an individual, had been so consumed by online hate and the things he'd been hearing on the radio or that he'd been reading. The premier at the time said, "Words cut like knives," and so it's really so crucial that we understand as a society, if we want to have a healthy, cohesive, united country, we really are going to need to pay more and more attention. And we have been. So there have been efforts to address the rise in online hate. There was online hate legislation that was on the order paper that we were seeing move towards legislation. That, of course, had to be paused due to prorogation. And so there's hope that a new government will institute these important efforts to rein in social media companies that have really allowed for hate to just completely take over many of our social media channels, and sadly, monetize the type of dangerous and divisive narratives that can continue to tear at our social fabric. And so we really do need to think about this on so many different levels, and to think about what kind of society are we actually building or protecting for our children.
Amira, I want to come a little bit to the personal. As someone in this role, you have been a target of attacks, both personally and professionally. You've faced disinfo and hate yourself, not just for your work, but for your identity as a Muslim woman. How do you deal with that? And what does it say about the times that we're in when even standing up against hate makes you a target?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, Saba, any person taking on a public role is going to face criticism, and is going to face, viewpoints that they may not agree with. So, on that front, it goes with the role, but at the same time, we're living where so much happens online, and anything can be said, and misinformation, disinformation can spread very quickly and take a life of its own. And so I think it is challenging for anyone to be in sort of the public eye, and in particular, it is difficult for women. Racialized women, we know that. You know that very well as a racialized Muslim journalist, and have faced your own set of hate and these types of digital attacks. And so it's not it's not something that anyone wants to go through. I can say that much. I signed up for this role because I really believe in Canada. I grew up here in Ottawa. I grew up with really positive experiences about what it meant to be different and have diverse identities, to be the daughter of, Egyptian immigrants, to be Muslim, to be Canadian. It was such a positive experience that once I started to realize what Islamophobia was, I had just started wearing the hijab. 9/11 happened. I was just graduating from journalism school at Carleton University, starting, my career, beginning with CBC radio here in Ottawa. When I started to realize that, all of a sudden, what I had taken for granted of, belonging to this place, a place that I love so deeply, that there were those who were going to push forward ideas about who I was, who our communities are, and view us in such negative ways. Like that really struck me deeply. And as a journalist and later as an advocate, these are issues that matter to me. And I've just wanted to continue to believe in a Canada where everyone belongs, and fighting for that in whatever way or capacity I've had the privilege of doing it. So I'm really privileged to be in this role. I take it very seriously. I meet with Canadians from so many different backgrounds. I was at a United Church the week of January 29th to commemorate the Quebec City massacre. And just the amount of love I received from the congregation, is probably enough to keep me going for another year. Just the amount of solidarity that fellow Canadians have towards any minority community that's going through difficulty is really something that you don't see in the headlines, that you don't see sort of go viral. But those opportunities to connect with people are so valuable. And I encourage all of us to really double down on those efforts to build our that social glue in our own communities, because it's what's going to keep us going and keep us optimistic.
Your role as Canada's special representative on Islamophobia has faced relentless political pushback, with some leaders questioning positions like yours and whether they're even needed. And now what we're seeing across the border with the re-election of Donald Trump, with DEI initiatives and anti-racism and anti-hate policies being rolled back, there are concerns that sentiments like those are taking root here as well. And about whether roles like yours will continue to exist. Do you worry about that? What do you worry about these days?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that Canadians right now are having a really key moment of figuring out what it is that makes Canada special and who we are special. And I'm here for it. I love Canada immensely. I have so much appreciation for all that I've been able to accomplish here, what my family's been able to contribute here. And so while there's so much more that we need to fix and work on, and we need to work on, truth and reconciliation, we need to work on anti-racism affecting various communities, we need to work on all of the things that make our communities more just for everyone, to address homelessness, hunger, all of these issues that are holding people back from their potential. These are all things that, as Canadians, I really believe we have shared values in a country that takes care of each other. So for me, I think that we're in a moment right now where it's hopeful also to see Canadians rally together around their identity as Canadians. And when we do that, and we do that proudly, we have to also understand the reason we're so proud of being Canadian includes having a country that is diverse, that is pluralistic, that is strong, that, my neighbors come from all over the world, and I love it and I cherish it and I learn from it. So I think that those aspects of the moment that we're in right now, I hope will sort of drive Canadians towards really holding on and cherishing the parts of us that allow us to address equity, to address diversity, to address inclusion, to combat Islamophobia and anti Semitism and anti Black racism and anti Indigenous hate and anti Asian, and all of it. Like, there's so much that our communities face in Canada, but together we're united that we can always do better for one another. And I think in this moment, that's really what we have to hold really onto quite dearly.
Well, thank you so much, Amira, for your time and for your insight and for your incredible patience with some of the technical issues that I was having. It was so wonderful to have you on the show. I also want to wish you Eid Mubarak way, way in advance. You're probably the first person to wish you that.
Well, thank you so much, Sabah, and it's really been a real pleasure to chat with you, and as well to you, Eid Mubarak in advance.
I was speaking with Canada's Special Representative on Combating Islamophobia, Amira Elghawaby. There's an audio version of this available as well, so catch it on This Matters wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to thestar.com and support our journalism. Let's talk again soon.